All right, kiddos and kidettes. In this notes video, I'm just going to be talking about how the U.S. actually gets involved in World War I, since it is taking place in Europe. So, like, why do we even get involved? So many Americans think of World War I as primarily a European conflict because that's who is fighting in the war. However, many had only been in the US for a couple of generations at this point, since it's the early 1900s, and a lot of people still had strong attachments to their home countries. Like a lot of Irish people came over, in the late 1800s and things like that. So only a couple of generations ago, people had come from Europe. Um, so August 4th, 1914, Woodrow Wilson declares that the U.S. is a neutral nation in World War I, because he's trying to protect U.S. economic interests at this point in time. And some Americans are hurt with Germans' unrestricted submarine warfare, because the Germans start just attacking whoever they can with their submarines, and they don't care who they're attacking. Um, and the US was supplying some nations in Europe with supplies during the first part of World War I. So the US starts arming merchant ships with, weapons to try and protect themselves against these German submarines that are coming at them. And then the Zimmerman Note is really what pushes the US to actually get involved in the war. So the Zimmerman Note was basically a note sent from Germany to Mexico, and they were basically like, hey, Mexico, have we got a proposition for you? Um, if you keep the US busy, we can have like a little alliance between us, and that would be good for Mexico. So the British intercepted this note and basically revealed it to the United States so that the US would join on their side, on the Ally side, when they came into the war. So the Zimmerman Note pushes the United States to join World War I. So when we do eventually join the war, there's a ton of stuff happening at the home front, which is the United States, during the war. So we're selling Liberty bonds. So the US government starts selling Liberty bonds, which are special war bonds that are used to support the Allied cause. And they end up raising more than $20 billion just off of selling Liberty bonds. There's lots of propaganda put out to kind of encourage people to buy Liberty bonds. They're declared a patriotic thing, a way to help your country without actually going to fight yourself. So lots of women were targeted to buy Liberty bonds during the war. Rationing was another thing that was happening on the home front. So rationing is when you distribute food and other goods in fixed amounts. So they limited their like meat intake, butter was rationed, gasoline was rationed during World War I. So there were lots of things coming out to kind of have replacements for different things that you no longer had accessible to you at all times. And then a lot of the food rationing was to kind of get some of this fresh food over to troops overseas so that they could have good meals while they were in Europe. Daylight savings time was also introduced during World War I, because it lessened the need for artificial light and lowered fuel consumption since it was lighter for more hours of the day. And then there was also a lot of propaganda aimed towards Germans. There was just this culture of hostility towards the Germans, Anything German was frowned upon. If you bought German products, German cars, anything like that, beer made by Germans, then you were considered not patriotic. You were not doing your portion for the country. um, so, in the actual war with the soldiers in Europe, we joined the Western Front in Europe. And more than 24 million men register for military service to try and volunteer themselves by 1918, and that's when the war ends. So this is the last year of war. So the US tries to stay out of the defensive war on the trenches, and we were kind of there to help on the offensive side. So we tried to stay out of the trenches as much as possible. We knew what was happening out there with trenches and how not a lot was happening. So tried to stay on the other side. March 3rd, 1918, Russia is like, we're out of here. We're done fighting this war. And then Germany can focus on the Western Front. So they're not defending from both sides. And then with the US support now, so we have fresh soldiers coming in because the other countries are kind of running low on young men at this point. The Allies are able to push the Germans out of France, and that's really a turning point for the war. So that is it for how America starts getting involved. In the next notes video, we'll talk about how America, or how America ends the war, how World War I is ended.